Mental health issues can be a really tricky situation to try to improve, and I get it. It can be a really big deal. Mental health issues can affect your life, they can affect relationships, they can affect your ability to create an income and have a place to live. It's not some sniffly nose situation. It can be a very big, life-changing situation to deal with. And understand that I don't really feel like very many people are actually crazy. They're just a little bit broken and they just need some help understanding how to correct the malfunctions or imbalances that are restricting the body from functioning the way that it's supposed to function. The body is this amazing mechanism, but it might not always function correctly. And there can be varying degrees of what somebody's going to call a crazy or mental health type issues. A person might just be dealing with a little bit of depression or anxiety, or maybe they have a hard time even getting out of bed at all the way up to somebody who is very certain that they are a fire truck. So there can be a wide range of different degrees of mental illness that can come on with a person, and that person may even experience different degrees of those issues from time to time. But it's not this issue of like, oh, these are just the cards that you were dealt. And, oh, I'm sorry, your mom was crazy, so you're going to be crazy too. It's not like this is just what you're stuck with. Now, there can be genetic factors that are handed down from person to person that can make a person gravitate towards imbalances or malfunctions in their body, but that doesn't mean that a person is just stuck with this and that's how they have to be. Now, I do understand your frustration in trying to find some answers that make sense. Like, why don't they make sense? Like with technology today, you can give me a trash can that talks to me and bags the trash up for me, but you can't give me an explanation for anxiety that is much more than sorry about your luck. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So if you've been researching this topic and having a hard time finding real answers, in this video I'm going to give you a different viewpoint. And sometimes it's really nice to have a different viewpoint when everybody else is saying the same thing that doesn't seem to be helping at all. So you're going to find a lot of experts out there that are going to tell you that nutrition is not really going to fix your mental health issues. And they'll say, oh, well, eating better really does show to create some improvements for some people, but it's not really going to fix it, so don't really focus on that. Most experts are going to have the point of view that, well, you need to take these 6 or 7 medications until we find one that really works for you, and we'll use that until it doesn't really work for you, and then we'll swap out these 3 medications for these other 4 ones, and we'll just do that until you end up in the ground. Or they're going to tell you, well, you need to sit and talk to a professional for 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for the next 15 years, and hopefully we'll make some progress. Now, both of these steps have the ability to really help some people. So that's what creates the confusion. But in this video, for the people who say that nutrition can't change these mental health issues, you're going to understand that, first of all, that these people are just adorable, but you're going to understand that they're wrong. And you're going to understand that there's people in the world that are improving their mental health issues every single day, and what's to say that you can't be one of those people? The body of evidence that's helping us understand that nutrition is a really big factor is becoming too much to ignore. So I'm going to share some studies and some scientific papers that help you understand that these answers are out there if a person's really willing to do the work and put the effort into creating these changes. But here's what I want you to understand before we get started. This is going to take some work. This video, we're going to take a deep dive and show you a wide variety of underlying causes that can create these different mental health issues. You're also going to understand that the same mental health issue can have totally different causes from person to person. That's why there's never going to be one solution for depression or one solution for anxiety, because these issues can have different underlying causes, so how could they ever have the same solution for every person? Now, there's going to be somebody in the comments that's going to say, hey, whippersnapper, quit yammering on, just tell me what I need to take so I'm not such a nutbag. So understand that I don't know what you should take because I don't know what's going on with your body and your body chemistry. It's really going to vary from person to person. So you're not going to find an explanation for what's been going wrong in your body for the last 30 years in a 40-second video clip. It's just not going to happen. I know you want it to happen, but I'm telling you it's just not gonna. So the sooner you can adapt that point of view, the sooner you can get to work to putting the effort towards creating real and lasting changes. So in this video, we're going to dig into the most common underlying causes. I'm going to give you some simple steps that you can test out right away, but then I'm going to help you understand why those simple steps only help some people and make some people even worse, along with steps you can take so those steps can work for you. Just know that for some people, this is going to be life-changing information. And I say that because after 20 years of researching nutrition and physiology and how the body works and sharing that information with others, that's what thousands of people have told me, that this was life-changing information for them. And when you can understand the most common underlying causes for these issues, it's just a matter of doing the work to correct those underlying causes. And remember that I'm not a doctor or a mental health expert. I'm someone just like you who had their own troubles. I lost my voice for 8 years, and after going through 23 doctors that couldn't help me figure out anything, I decided I was going to research this and figure out my own answers. And in that whole process, I experienced mental health issues, and I was able to get past those. And I'm going to explain in this video why those issues came up for me and the steps that I took to correct those as well. But because I'm not a doctor spouting out the same information that everybody else is telling you, and I've actually been through this situation, you actually might find a piece of information that could actually make sense to you. So let's jump over to the smartboard and see if we can help you find some information that might make some sense.
TC Hale is not a doctor and does not claim to be a doctor or licensed in any type of medical field. Don't be an idiot and use anything heard on the show as medical advice. This information should be used for educational purposes only, and you should contact your doctor for any medical advice. Now get off me.
So when we're talking about mental health issues, the most important thing that I want you to understand in this video is that I don't want you to learn any piece of information in this video and say, oh man, well that's way better than what I'm doing. I'm just going to stop everything that I'm doing and do that instead. If you're taking some type of medication or working with some type of health professional that is helping you in any way, you want to keep doing that until you correct the actual underlying cause of what's creating these problems for you. So when we're working with clients, we help them work on their body chemistry, but we tell them keep doing whatever you're doing that's allowing you to function better at all. And a lot of people don't want to do these medications and things. They say they have side effects, or maybe I remove all the highs and the lows, but I just feel like a zombie walking around everywhere I go. But maybe that's what you need to do just to allow yourself to continue being a human while you can work on these things. Some of these things are going to take time and effort. You're not going to fix it by Thursday so you can go to that hoedown that you want to go to. This stuff is going to take time. And also understand that once you can comprehend the mechanisms that are creating these problems, it will make sense to you how they can take the brain to such a dark place. And you don't want to allow yourself to go to such a dark place that some bad things can happen. It's very common. It happens a lot. So you want to do whatever you can to keep yourself out of a dark place. And I'm going to share some depression issues that I went through in this video. And when I was there, I'll be honest, I was never suicidal to that point, but I did have the point of view of like, you know what, if I got hit by a bus, it really wouldn't be so bad. And that's not really where you want to be. But the point is, I don't feel that way now. I generally avoid buses and oncoming traffic at all costs. So just know that if you feel like you're gravitating towards a dark place, you won't always be there if you do the work to pull yourself out. But if you do get there, get some help. You know, there's always family and friends, but if you're not comfortable with that, or maybe your family sucks, you know, they're not very helpful, know that there are other options. You can Google these phone numbers where you just call this phone number and some lady named Betty picks up the phone and talks to you and helps you walk through the situation that you're dealing with until it becomes a situation that you can tolerate. So if there's help out there and you need help, just get the help. Why not get the help? So when we're digging into these mental health issues, know that some of the stuff that I talk about in this video is going to be a little bit more complicated and is going to take some effort for you to figure out what's actually going on in your body. So I first want to talk about some of these general influences that are coming into the mainstream and that people are saying, oh, if you do these might help, because they've shown to help some people. So I want to kind of go over some studies that talk about the influence of diet and eating a lot of ultra and processed foods or a lot of sugars, as well as protein intake. So we'll start off on this paper here on food and mood, how do diet and nutrition affect mental well-being. And when we're talking about nutrition, it's important to understand that nutrition is not just, oh, what I put on my plate. That's my diet. That's not really what nutrition is. That's more of what your diet is. Nutrition is what the cells see. So it's not just a matter of your choices of what you're eating, though that matters a lot. It matters in what your body's ability to process that particular food appropriately. So a lot of people, you're going to understand, can't process certain types of foods, and some people process them in a way that can cause a lot of trouble. But this paper here says healthy eating patterns such as the Mediterranean diet are associated with better mental health than unhealthy eating patterns such as the Western diet. And the Western diet is what we eat in America, and it's mostly garbage and it's mostly processed junk. And I've never once said to a client, hey, I want you to eat a Mediterranean diet. But a Mediterranean diet is basically a lot of fruits and vegetables, and they even include like healthy whole grains, which I don't feel are actually healthy for most people. But it's more of removing most of the processed food. So it's looking at eating more real food. So when I'm working with a client, I like them to eat real food. I like them to gravitate towards eating real food and reduce all this packaged and processed junk as much as you can. So there's studies that are showing that this has the ability to improve situations for some people. But if you've tried that and that didn't work, it's okay. You're going to understand why when we get through this video. And this here says ultra-processed food exposure and adverse health outcomes, umbrella review of epidemiological meta-analysis. And they say that we found evidence supporting direct associations between greater exposure to ultra-processed foods and a higher risk of the prevalence of adverse sleep-related outcomes as well as anxiety outcomes. So they're seeing here that when you eat a lot of processed foods, it has the ability to create a lot of this trouble that can lead to these mental health issues. And on this paper with the relationships between sugar intake from sweet food and beverages, common mental disorder and depression, prospective findings from the Whitehall 2 cohort study. And their conclusion was our findings using repeated measures, follow-up data over 22 years suggest an adverse effect of sugar intake from sweet food and beverages on long-term psychological health. So this is not surprising to any of us. A lot of us hear, oh, you know, sugar's not good for you. But in this video, you're going to understand why. It's not this thing of sugar's not good for you. It's sugar changes the way that your body operates, and it changes the way that the brain operates. So another important piece of information is this association between dietary protein intake and the risk of depressive symptoms in adults. And they say that there were 1,647 participants identified as having depressive symptoms. The total protein intake was significantly lower among participants with depressive symptoms. So when we get to some of these underlying causes, you're going to understand why a lot of people might gravitate away from eating a lot of protein. Maybe they feel lousy when they eat protein. And when they do that, they're going to gravitate more towards more of these ultra-processed carbohydrates or these sugars. And these studies here are showing us that those can be problematic over the long haul. But when you understand the things you're going to understand in this video, you can see why people go that route anyways. And we're going to talk about ways to correct those issues. But these are just some general things that a person is going to be able to try right away. They can test out. What happens if I eat more real food? You know, food that came from an animal or out of the ground or from a tree, or, you know, those are real food things. There's a lot of options available there. What can happen if I reduce the processed foods and the sugars that I consume? Do I feel better? What if I increase protein? You're going to understand why this is important. So these are all general things that you could turn off this video and just test out right now and see how they help you feel. But what we really want to do is dig into the physiology and understand why these things help some people. And if they don't help you, what steps do you need to take so that they can benefit your situation. So what I want to do is I want to go through a variety of imbalances or malfunctions that can happen in the body and how they can affect how your body is processing nutrition. And I also want to talk about and bring in some of these issues that people experience that are more common when we're talking about mental health, like the depression and anxiety and panic disorders in bipolar, schizophrenia, paranoia, OCD, and ADHD. And there are other issues that come up. I understand that. I might not talk specifically about some of them. Some of them will really flag videos when you even mention them at all, so might not bring those up. But just understand that you're going to understand how some of these issues can affect how the brain and body work together. And when we look at signs of these possible things that could lead to mental illness, well, we all kind of deal with a little bit of this in some respect. So that's going to help us understand that when we're looking at somebody that thinks that they're a fire truck, are they really so much different from someone who might get a little bit more irritable or has unreasonable anger a little easier than someone else? Maybe it's just really a magnified version of what a lot of us deal with from time to time. So the first thing that I want to dig into is this issue of the hypoglycemic reaction. So let's look at this study here of risk of depression and anxiety disorders according to long-term glycemic variability. And what that means is that just means that their blood sugar is really not on an even keel like we really want it to be. They're seeing really big spikes and crashes in that blood sugar, and that seems to be creating trouble. They say our studies suggest that increased glycemic variability and persistent hyperglycemia, which is high blood sugar, are associated with depression and anxiety disorders. This indicates that continuous hyperglycemia, increased glycemic variability identified during routine health examinations may be related to the development of depression and anxiety symptoms. So when somebody tells you that what you eat is not really going to affect your mental illness, this study is saying otherwise. What we eat has the ability to affect our glycemic variability. And this study here on generalized anxiety disorder and hypoglycemia symptoms improved with diet modification, their conclusion was dietary carbohydrates may be significantly related to emotional and cognitive symptoms such as anxiety and difficulty concentrating. And as part of the study, they looked at a 15-year-old female who presented with concerns of generalized anxiety disorder and hypoglycemia symptoms. Her diet consisted primarily of refined carbohydrates. The addition of protein, fat, and fiber to her diet resulted in a substantial decrease in anxiety symptoms, as well as a decrease in the frequency and severity of hypoglycemia symptoms. A brief return to her previous diet caused a return of her anxiety symptoms, followed by improvement when she restarted the prescribed diet. And this is something that I've seen hundreds of times in person with clients, is people changing the way that they're eating, changing the way that they're bringing nutrition and giving those cells nutrition and seeing great improvement to their symptoms, and then saying, oh man, I really don't feel well again. Well, what have you been eating? Well, I went back to what I was eating before because I thought I was okay, and then all those symptoms came right back. So this might take some effort to really sustain some things, but it's really great to understand, oh, I have the ability to improve how I feel. I can be a participant in my own health. Isn't that really something? So what all of this means is that for most people, the brain really needs glucose to operate correctly. And the weird part is that we know this. There's national commercials for candy bars that show these people that are just kind of going nuts and just acting like they normally wouldn't act. And oh yeah, you just needed this candy bar and now you're back to acting like a human in your normal self again. So we kind of know these things. And the reality is that the body and the brain, they have backup fuel sources that they have the ability to utilize. Some people can switch to where the body and the brain are really operating off of fat or ketones and even glucose that the body makes on its own. And it functions quite well, and in some cases even more optimally. But what I'm going to explain here is going to help you understand why some people really only have glucose as a fuel source, and when it disappears, they have no fuel source. So when we're eating carbohydrates and sugars in higher amounts in a way that's going to spike our blood sugar and create that glucose variability that they were talking about, when we see this glucose come up here, which is the blue line, what follows is insulin. And the body raises insulin, and that insulin helps us sweep that glucose out of the bloodstream and allow it to be used as fuel. So that's the insulin's job. But when we bring this glucose up, the insulin can sweep that blood sugar out to where it will come back down, but the insulin will stay high a lot longer. So the problem with that is that the insulin tells the body, don't use fat for fuel right now, don't use your backup fuel source, because we still have plenty of sugar available. even though it's really not available. This insulin staying high blocks the ability to use that backup fuel source. So the way that a lot of people eat, where they're spiking their blood sugar, also has the ability to create a crash in blood sugar. So now they have no fuel. Well, now I need a snack. Well, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to have a bag of chips. And they have some bag of chips that spikes their blood sugar again. So insulin never had a chance to come down so that their body could even access that stored fat and burn it for fuel. This is also why a lot of people will gain weight, but not everybody in this scenario is going to gain weight for a variety of reasons. It's just a possibility. But when someone keeps creating these spikes and crashes, you can see that the insulin is staying high all day long. They never had the ability to access this backup fuel source that the body was designed to use. So the more they spike and the harder they crash, the more of these episodes of my brain not really working correctly are going to show up for them. So if a person can change the way they're eating and keep their blood sugar on a more even keel, maybe they're just eating proteins and fats and fibers and smaller amounts of carbohydrates like we did with this girl in the study, then you're going to see that the blood sugar only comes up some and the insulin only comes up some. So when the blood sugar starts to go down, the body's like, no problem. I'll just burn fat for fuel because I have access to this backup fuel source since the insulin is not way up here blocking that access. So when we all see these candy bar commercials, we all say, oh yeah, either I felt like that at one point, or we say, oh yeah, I know somebody who's just like that and you really got to feed them or they're just a jerk or they can't even function as a human being. We all say that. We all understand that. But we never think to look at the fact that that could just be a smaller version or a less severe version of what a lot of people are dealing with when they deal with their brain really not working well at all for longer periods of time. So what we have to understand is because some people will eat this junk and this processed food and this sugar all day long and they don't have any mental health issues, so that must not be the problem, right? But the issue is that different people process these foods differently. We don't all process food the same way. We all have a unique bio-individuality, and that's why different foods are going to affect people differently. So if a person has their insulin working in a more aggressive manner, that can really magnify this problem. So what we have to understand is that for an imbalance to be possible in the body, that can only occur if there can also be an imbalance in the other direction. If there can't, then there is no balance. There is no middle ground. So there's always going to be two sides to the coin. So we all know that people become insulin resistant, and that means that the cells are not really listening to that insulin and they can't process that glucose very effectively, and then blood sugar goes very high, and a la peanut butter sandwiches, I'm a type 2 diabetic. So we all understand that now. We know that that's a fact. But if that's a fact, that means that there can also be people who process that glucose too aggressively. And that's what's called hypoglycemic type reactions. So that just means that someone's insulin is sweeping out way too much glucose, way too fast, almost like it's a bully. So their insulin may not even come up super high because they don't need a whole lot of it, because when they eat carbohydrates or sugars, it's going to create an aggressive blood sugar crash because that insulin is working so over aggressively. So if a person is dealing with these hard sugar crashes where the brain really doesn't have any fuel to function correctly, you can do two things. You can either change the way that they're eating, where they can eat less carbs and try to keep that blood sugar on a more even keel. That can be one way to help. Or you can also help to change their body chemistry so that that insulin is not such a bully. It's not overly processing that glucose so aggressively, and then they don't create such a hard crash. Now, for a lot of people, you're going to understand in a few minutes why they have a hard time gravitating to more fats or more proteins and fibers and less of these carbohydrates. But when you can help them do that, it can really create some improvements in this area if this is the underlying cause for what they're dealing with. So one thing we look at with our clients is the pH of the urine. And if that pH of their urine, if they test that with just common pH strips you can pick up at most health food stores, if they test their urine at least 2 hours after a meal, but not first thing in the morning, it should be after a meal, and if that urine pH is like 6.2 or higher, that can be a strong sign that insulin could be working a little bit too aggressively. Now, this is not a diagnostic thing by any means. You might see people that are type 2 diabetic with a higher urine pH for some other reason, but it's very common to see this. So if someone was having hypoglycemic type reactions and they saw that their urine pH was high like that, they could take steps to lower that urine pH and then see, is it easier to keep that blood sugar on a more even keel and remove some of those spikes and crashes that are restricting the brain's ability to function the way that the brain's supposed to. So before we talk about how this can affect specific mental health issues, let's add one more piece to the puzzle and talk about another underlying cause that also really has the ability to magnify the effects of this problem here. And that's an electrolyte deficiency. And basically electrolytes are minerals in the body, and they're used for a wide variety of functions in the body. And when I'm talking about minerals, I'm not talking about a specific mineral like magnesium and potassium. All of these things are very important. When I'm talking about minerals and mineral deficiencies, I'm just talking about minerals in general. We get minerals from the food that we eat. We can get minerals in the water and the things like that that we're drinking, supplements that we're taking. All these things can bring minerals into the body. But minerals are very important for the body and the brain to function correctly. Basically, one important function for these minerals is to act as a way for signals to travel from the body to the brain and from the brain back to the body so that they can communicate, hey, this is kind of what's going on. Oh, this is what happened. Those signals are very important. And when there's not enough minerals in the system, those signals can kind of drop off and nothing functions the way that it's really supposed to function. The person can often feel very depressed and just feel like, I just don't feel like things are working correctly. But when we look back at this issue with the hypoglycemic thing where blood sugar is spiking and then creating those crashes, one important function for these minerals is to act as like a buffer system. So if there's enough minerals in the system, when blood sugar goes low, the body can still function as long as those minerals are there to kind of buffer those low blood sugars. But when minerals go really low, if there's enough blood sugar there, that can buffer those low minerals. It's when both blood sugar and minerals both go low at the same time that someone is usually going to have some type of problem. And some of those problems can be very significant. Things like dizzy spells and even seizures. So we really want the body to have the resources that it needs to function correctly. So if someone has low minerals, that doesn't mean that they're going to be hypoglycemic. If someone is having hypoglycemic reactions, that doesn't mean they're going to have low mineral levels. But when you have both of them together, you're really going to see some magnified reactions. And when someone has low minerals, they're often going to have significant cravings. They won't always, but in most cases you're going to see some sugar, maybe some chocolate, maybe some carbohydrate, or salt cravings. All of these things are the body telling you, hey, I need more of something to come in here so that I can buffer the things that are not coming in. So if I don't have enough minerals, maybe I'm going to scream for sugar. Last time you ate those Nilla wafers, man, I just broke those down real quick and then I had this glucose available and I wasn't so freaked out about the mineral levels going low. I'm going to send the signal, go get me some Nilla wafers. And all of a sudden the person has these crazy, insane cravings where they're knee deep into a box of Nilla wafers when they didn't even know they had Nilla wafers. So that's very common to see. So something that we can look at to get an idea of where our minerals are, we don't always need to necessarily run mineral tests to know which mineral is at a specific level. If we can just look at our blood pressure at a resting state, so at least 2 hours after a meal, you don't want all that digestive process going on when you're checking your blood pressure, but not first thing in the morning either. Again, it should be after a meal. And if that systolic number, which is the top number, is below 112, that can be a sign that minerals are going low in the system. So when we're looking at blood pressure, we're kind of looking at sugars in the system, minerals in the system, protein a little bit, and even filth as well. But when that blood pressure goes low, this is not a diagnostic thing again, it's just a sign that minerals may be going low. And that's just one indication that, oh, this may make sense to why I'm depressed. If my blood pressure is really low, all of a sudden me feeling depressed or anxious actually makes some sense. But this is such a strong correlation that when we see a client come to us that's dealing with depression issues, our first question is, what's your blood pressure? It's almost always low. We're going to talk about some scenarios where it might not be, but we just see this over and over again. And when you can help a person lift those mineral levels, all of a sudden they start to feel and function a whole lot better. And just to make sure you understand that I didn't get this from a Paw Patrol coloring book, in this study here on association of low blood pressure with anxiety and depression, they say that low blood pressure has mainly been regarded as ideal, but recent studies have indicated an association with depression. And that's pretty common. Most of the time when somebody goes to the doctor and their blood pressure is, like 92/60, the doctor's going to be, oh, great job, because they know the person's not going to have a blowout or some type of stroke or heart attack situation from this high blood pressure. Great job. The problem is a lot of people don't like to drive around on flat tires all day. And that's basically what's going on when someone has really low blood pressure and low mineral levels. So an important thing to consider is antidepressants when we're looking at blood pressure in people dealing with depression. This study here says depression is associated with decreased blood pressure, but antidepressant use increase the risk for hypertension. So they say that the large-scale cohort study showed that when compared with healthy controls, subjects with depression issues have a significantly lower systolic blood pressure and are less likely to have isolated systolic hypertension. So they're saying that they're also seeing this correlation between low blood pressure and depression. And our viewpoint is that a lot of antidepressants work because they have the ability to restrict a person's ability to pee out their salts and to pee minerals out of the system. It kind of causes them to hold them in the system, and then the minerals raise in the system. Often their blood pressure will come up too, and they'll feel and function a whole lot better. But we also see people come to us like, yeah, I've been on antidepressants for 25 years and now I just had to go on hypertension medication. I'm on these medications that lower my blood pressure because my blood pressure is through the roof. So basically they're using a medication that can raise blood pressure and then they're using another medication to lower that blood pressure. So it's like they're driving around in their car with their foot slammed down on the brakes and the gas at the same time. If you've never tried that, I'll let you know it's not going to go great. So this is a really common mistake that we see made in the world, and it's kind of a big deal. But it helps us understand why some of these antidepressants might be helping some people. Some of them feel like there's other functions that go on with these antidepressants, and I believe that to be true too. But our viewpoint is that they often help because they're raising that blood pressure by restricting a person's ability to pee out those salts. So this study also wanted to see in use with these antidepressants also increased blood pressure, and these subjects were more often diagnosed as stage 1 hypertensive. So this is something that we see with clients, but this study is also seeing the same thing. So if someone's going to look at their blood pressure to see, well, is my blood pressure low? Is this lack of electrolytes part of the problem for me? If they're on antidepressants, they may see a good blood pressure number. It may be like 120/80, but is that really your blood pressure number? It's kind of being masked by the effects of the medication. Other things that we want to think about is that if blood sugar is also high, that can also raise the pressure needed to push that blood through the system, because the sugar can thicken up that blood, more electrolytes can thicken up that blood, but also so can filth and junk. So if a person doesn't have the ability to detox correctly and there's just a lot of junk in the system, that could be raising the blood pressure into what's viewed as a good range when the reality is that their minerals are very low. So if there's other symptoms that are indicating that minerals are very low, that can be a helpful piece of information. Things like vertigo or dizzy spells or cravings or fatigue. And a lot of these things can have other causes as well. But when you see a lot of things starting to line up that's screaming, hey, minerals are really low, even when blood pressure is in a good range, then we can look, oh, is blood sugar really high? Does this make sense? We want to look at all the factors instead of just one. When we're looking at studies, they look at a factor, but when you want to look at a person and really help that person, you really got to look at everything that's going on to get a picture of what's going to help them the most. So why would mineral levels be going low? Well, there's a variety of issues that can go on. Some people will pee out a lot more minerals than they really should. And something that's interesting when we go back to this hypoglycemic thing and why it's so common to see people that are dealing with both of these issues, where there's a lack of minerals and hypoglycemic type reactions going on. If this insulin is acting like a bully, like we talked about, when they eat carbs and sugars, the body doesn't need to make a whole lot of insulin to sweep all that out. Remember, the insulin's acting like a bully, so the body will just make a small amount of insulin. So that means that their insulin is going to stay very low most of the time. Well, very low insulin levels seem to have the ability to cause some people to pee out more minerals. And we see this a lot with people doing like keto or carnivore diets, where they're eating like no carbohydrates. And I'm not saying that these diets are wrong. I use them myself. I use them with some clients when they're appropriate. But if a person has really low mineral levels and they go on a no carbohydrate diet, it's going to bring insulin way down. They'll often pee out way too many minerals and have all these symptoms show up. And they'll be like, what? Carnivore diet's horrible. Why was this a good idea? But they just don't understand that they don't qualify to use that diet. So that's one reason that can cause some people to pee out way too many minerals than they really should. And sometimes people, there's requirements that are needed. You know, women that are having a menstrual cycle, there's a lot of requirements needed to run that cycle. It's an expensive cycle to run, and that's why a lot of people's symptoms will really magnify around that cycle. All these nutrients and resources and minerals are going towards making this reproductive cycle work, and then as that's going on, the person just feels really lousy, and a lot of those symptoms that they experience, like depression and anxiety and all those kind of things, can really get magnified. So sometimes it's just that there's a lot going on in the body. Maybe the body's dealing with some type of invader or infection, and a lot of resources are going towards dealing with that. So that may be something that's kind of using up a lot of the resources as well. And a good way to kind of understand this more is when we look at postpartum depression. And this is a very common thing to see, and the answers for this are, I don't know. And what's going on in our viewpoint is that the mother just took all of these resources to build a human being. You know, if you're going to build something like a human, it takes a lot of resources to do that. If you were going to build a house, you would need like wood or concrete or bricks or nails. You would need stuff to build that house. If you didn't have enough stuff, your housewarming party would just be a bunch of people standing around your yard eating egg salad. So when we're looking at making another human, that takes a lot of resources. So when the mother gives birth and they've completed this process of building this human being, well, a lot of times they've just stripped everything that they have. The kid just literally sucked the life out of them, and it's probably going to continue for the next 18 to 25 years or so. But the reality is that a lot of times this is what that postpartum depression is about. That's not to say that there can be other causes, but a lot of times when a woman is like, oh, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me, how can I possibly be depressed? Well, you just gave all of your resources to this other human being. It might take a while to kind of reaccumulate enough resources for your body to function the way that you want it to function. But this is a good confirmation of kind of what we're seeing with clients when we look at things like depression and anxiety. And when we look at other symptoms that might be confirming that electrolytes and minerals are really low, that can be helpful too. We'll put a link in the description below this video for our video on signs of low electrolytes, so you can see our other of these things kind of going on. But the main and the most common reason that someone would have a lack of electrolytes is usually going to be digestive issues. So if a person is dealing with any digestive symptoms at all, like burping or bloating or acid reflux or constipation or diarrhea or indigestion or nausea, or maybe food just kind of sits there like a rock in your stomach for 6 hours, or even acne or skin issues, all of those are signs that this digestive process is not working correctly. There's some type of malfunction going on. And when there's malfunctions, then we can't really break the food down so that we can access all the nutrients and all the minerals in that food. It's why we eat food. We eat food to get the nutrients out of that food, not because it's delicious. And when this food comes in, it needs to be acidified in the stomach by hydrochloric acid or HCl. That has to be acidified to start that breakdown process. And then once the food is acidified correctly, it'll leave and come down here into the duodenum, and that triggers this gallbladder to squirt this alkaline bile stuff down to help neutralize those acids and also emulsify or break down our dietary fats so that we can use those fats for all the purposes that the body needs fats, but also so we can access fat-soluble vitamins like A, E, D, and K. Those are kind of big deals. And those processes also trigger the pancreas to shoot out this bicarb that helps us neutralize these acids, along with enzymes. Pancreas also puts out these hormones that help us balance our blood sugar, like insulin and glucagon. So all of these functions in here are very important to really break down that food and get the nutrients out of that food. If things are moving through this small intestine when they haven't really been broken down correctly, it's very difficult for us to assimilate the nutrients in whatever we ate. And we may be eating really healthy food, but if we can't break it down, it's just turning into this toxic gook. If things are not acidified correctly, then it has to break down by like rotting and fermenting, and that all creates chemicals and toxins and junk. And it's very common for someone not to be making enough stomach acid for a wide variety of reasons. A lot of people turn off their stomach acid on a daily basis on purpose. And it's also very common for this bile to become too thick and sticky to flow correctly, and then it won't come down and help us digest our food correctly. A lot of people have had their gallbladder removed because that bile became so thick and sticky that it concentrated into either sludge or even stones and created all this trouble, so they had to have it removed. So that can create some digestive malfunctions as well. So if anything is disrupting this cycle, any of these functions are not working correctly, it's hard to really access those nutrients. And what's really problematic is if somebody doesn't have enough stomach acid, not only can they not break their food down, that stomach acid is the barrier to the whole digestive tract. So all these varmints are now going to come in, and they're going to set up camp, and they're going to have a keg party and raise their kids, and it's going to be great in the stomach for them because that acid isn't there to fry them. That acid is supposed to fry them in an acid bath when they come in. Wipe them out. So when there's not enough stomach acid, they come in, they set up camp here. They can also come down in the small intestine and create a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, like all the cool kids have today. And then eventually they can also move down here into the large intestine and create this dysbiosis issue that we hear so much about. And the bad guys start to take over where this good bacteria should be, that's really helping us further break down that food and get all of those nutrients out of that food. So any type of overgrowth also has the ability to create trouble. A lot of times the waste product from an overgrowth in the stomach will be alkaline. So they'll be putting out this alkaline waste, making their environment better for them, but also reducing further your ability to acidify your food. So that can create a lot of trouble. And here's where it gets even worse. Remember that we talked about before that, oh wow, you can do a whole lot better if you reduce the amount of processed foods or carbohydrates and sugars that you're consuming. If you eat more protein and put more fats and fibers into your diet, you feel better, like that girl in the study. But the problem is, if someone doesn't have their digestion functioning correctly and they try to increase protein, but they can't even break down protein because they're not making enough stomach acid, they're going to feel lousy. Protein sitting there rotting and fermenting for 6 hours, they're going to feel horrible. I ain't eating that again. Somebody said it was healthy. I feel horrible. Well, if the bile isn't flowing correctly and they try to consume more dietary fats so that they can reduce the carbohydrates they're consuming, they're not going to be able to break down those dietary fats correctly. They're going to feel lousy because that bile is not flowing down to help emulsify those dietary fats. So a lot of people will start gravitating more towards these carbohydrates, and the more carbohydrates that a person consumes, carbohydrates and sugars, when they're eating these in excess, especially with these processed foods, it has the ability to raise that urine pH like we talked about and make the body more aggressive at processing those carbohydrates and sugars. So it's like, oh man, they're bringing in all these carbs and sugars. I better get better at processing these. And as it gets a whole lot better, that insulin turns into a bully, and then we get those sharp crashes. And that usually happens for a while until the person's been doing it for so long and so excessively that the body starts to become insulin resistant. So that can change what's going on. And that's why we see such varied results in these studies. And why did this help one person and not another? Well, it depends on how your body is processing the types of foods that you're eating. Do you have the ability to break down proteins correctly? If you do, then you're a person that could increase your protein intake, maybe reduce your carbohydrates and sugars, and start to feel and function a whole lot better. But if you're not digesting protein, you're going to be like, well, that didn't work. That was a stupid idea. So you would really first need to correct these digestive malfunctions before you qualify to take those steps. But when we look at studies that show this as well, we see depressive symptoms in patients with irritable bowel syndrome, a meta-analysis, and they say in this study, compared to healthy controls, IBS patients had more severe depressive symptoms overall. And IBS is a situation where there are digestive malfunctions that are creating this irritable bowel situation. And whether those malfunctions are a lack of stomach acid or bile is not flowing well enough to neutralize the acids that are coming through, and then these acids continue to move through the digestive tract and irritate this lining. Acids are meant to be here, but if this bile is not coming down and helping trigger this bicarb for all these things to neutralize these acids, they continue to move through and irritate this intestinal lining and create inflammation or irritation. So a lack of bile flow has the ability to create problems down here. If someone isn't making enough stomach acid, that can result in an IBS-C or constipation type situation where everything is now moving through very slow. It gets a lot more dry and a lot more hard and a lot more difficult to pass. But in either of those situations, whether a person is leaning towards loose stools and diarrhea or constipation issues, in neither situation is the person really assimilating all the nutrients in the food they're eating. It's either screaming through the system too quickly to have time for you to assimilate the nutrients in that. It's shooting out the back door and lifting you off the toilet like a rocket. How are you going to get all the nutrients out of the food? If you're not acidifying the food and everything's going very slowly, then you didn't acidify it enough to really break it down and get the nutrients out of that. So why wouldn't these folks in this study show more signs of depressive issues if the body's not bringing in the nutrients and the minerals that the body needs for the body and the brain to function correctly? In this paper on functional dyspepsia, they say although functional dyspepsia is not associated with increased mortality, it does cause significant physical and mental distress, impacting the patient's quality of life. Patients with functional dyspepsia often score higher on psychometric tests for symptoms of anxiety, depression, and somatization. Don't get me started on somatization. And they say approximately 10 to 25% of patients report that the social impact of their symptoms is significant enough to seek medical attention, resulting in increased healthcare visits, significant health impairment, and a decline in overall quality of life. And dyspepsia, if you don't understand, is basically indigestion, and there's a lot of discomfort that goes on with dyspepsia. We have other videos that dig deep into dyspepsia, but it's basically when you look at indigestion, they're trying to tell you right there in the name, indigestion. It's a lack of digestion. It's a lack of these things working correctly. And when there's not enough stomach acid to break the food down, all that rotting and fermenting and those gases create like pressure and toxins that push out on your stomach or your intestinal tract and create all that bloating or cramping. And if bacteria overgrowth gets in there, well, that's a whole other game then, because they're putting out all these wastes and gases that are creating a lot more discomfort too. So when we're looking at dyspepsia, we're looking at an inability to break the food down and get all the nutrients out of that food. And when they call this somatization, it's actually a situation where basically they're saying, oh, that symptom is just in your head. You know, that nausea, all that pain, all that discomfort, all that gastrointestinal discomfort that you're having doesn't really have a medical cause, so it must just be in your head. And they're saying that that's common with dyspepsia, that it's common with an inability to break your food down. So when you're looking at some of the things you're saying and you're trying to look for these answers, sometimes it can be helpful to just have the viewpoint of help is not coming. I know that we want people to just find our answers for us and give us this pill that's going to fix everything that's going wrong. But if you can take the viewpoint of help is not coming, then you know that you need to put that effort in and that you need to do the research to figure out what's going on to turn your situation around. That doesn't mean that you don't need the help of doctors, but you need to know more so you know the right questions to ask them and the right direction to steer your own efforts when it comes to your nutrition. Which again, remember, that means what you're putting on your plate, but also your body's ability to access what's in what you're putting on the plate. Now, to further look into this lack of stomach acid, we see this study on association of suicidal ideation and depression with the use of proton pump inhibitors in adults, a cross-sectional study. And they say this study revealed that the recent use of PPIs was associated with suicidal ideation and depression among U.S. non-institutionalized adults using data from a nationally representative survey. The associations found in this study proposed the potential psychological effects of PPI use. So they found that they were seeing a lot more depressive and anxiety type issues when they're looking at PPI use. And just keep in mind that a person doesn't have to be using a PPI, which is a proton pump inhibitor, a medication that people use for acid reflux symptoms a lot. They don't need to be using a PPI not to be making enough stomach acid. There's a wide variety of reasons that a person might not be making enough stomach acid. But this PPI use issue was the issue for me. When I lost my voice and I was going to all these doctors and each doctor seemed to be making things worse and not finding any answers at all, I was using a lot of different PPIs. And that was the time when I started to feel depressed. And for me, it was just really weird. I've never been a guy that would lean anywhere towards that depressed situation. And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, you had just lost your voice. Your whole world just got wrecked. You couldn't work. Everything was ruined. Why wouldn't you be depressed? But I can remember thinking that my viewpoint was that that wasn't what was making me depressed. I had this viewpoint with my health issue that I was just going to figure it out. With my naive self, I just assumed I was going to figure it out. And I felt like the depression that I was feeling was coming from inside me. And once I fixed my digestive issues, that was totally gone and it did not ever come back. So that's important to kind of understand that this is something that we see a lot. And it might not be a lack of stomach acid. There can be other digestive issues, and a lot of these studies are confirming that. And that's also going to help us understand why we can't just find an answer for these problems. But when there's not enough stomach acid, we can't get the nutrients from the food. So when we're looking at digestive requirements, what's really interesting is that one of the things that the body needs to be able to make hydrochloric acid are some minerals. There's minerals that are needed, like zinc, so that the body can make that hydrochloric acid. It needs chloride to make hydrochloric acid. And if the body doesn't have enough acid, it can't break down its food correctly to get enough minerals that it has what it needs to be able to make that hydrochloric acid. So a person can get stuck in this cycle of not having enough stomach acid to break their food down correctly and an inability to get the minerals out of the food to give the body what it needs to make the hydrochloric acid. So they can get stuck with broken digestion for years or decades. And another thing that we need to look at when we're looking at mental health issues is the autonomic nervous system. And this is basically a system that runs the show behind the curtains in the body. And like we don't have to think about breathing, it just kind of happens. And that's the autonomic nervous system. And there's a parasympathetic rest and digest side and a sympathetic fight or flight side. And the body will move back and forth between those states dependent on the situations that are coming up. So in order for us to be able to produce this hydrochloric acid, the body needs to be able to move into this parasympathetic rest and digest side. So if a person is really stressed all the time, they can get really stuck in this sympathetic state. And this sympathetic fight or flight state changes the way that our body operates in an effort to optimize for survival. So if you're running from a lion, the body's going to change how it's operating to optimize your ability to get away from that lion, to run away from that lion. It's not going to optimize for you to digest a sandwich. There's no scenario where you're going to run from a lion and grab a cheeseburger to drive through and eat that as you're running from the lion. That would never happen. Why would the body need to optimize for both of those situations? It wouldn't. So it's not designed to do that. The problem is the body is designed to deal with stress for 3 or 4 minutes at a time. Most stresses in nature happen for 3 or 4 minutes at a time. But the stress for us lasts for months or years. So we're stressed because we can't pay the rent or because our boss is a jerk. We're not stressed because we're running from a lion. So if we really get stuck in that fight or flight state, it can be difficult to move into that parasympathetic rest and digest state, and it can be difficult for some of these things to function correctly. And another thing to think about is that sometimes the person won't have stress in their life it's stress going on in the body. The body is really stressed because maybe there's an infection the person doesn't know about. Maybe there's just a lack of resources and the body doesn't have the resources it needs to run all the functions that it needs to run. That's very stressful. I would be like you trying to pay $800 worth of bills with 12 bucks. That's a big stress. So the body could be stressed and moving into this sympathetic fight or flight state and causing some trouble. And that's kind of interesting. Let's look at some of these other symptoms that come up and how this can relate to some of these things that we've talked about. Because one thing to think about with this fight or flight state and being stuck in that state, a lot of people that are really overly irritable or get unreasonably angry very easily are kind of stuck in that fight or flight state. They're kind of on edge all the time because the body is kind of freaking out for one reason or another. And that seems to have the ability for some folks to create this anxiety. It's almost like a situation where the body is anxious about its circumstances, and then, anxiety really comes from circumstances in our life. There's some type of event that happens or some type of circumstance that makes us anxious. But a lot of times there are things in the body that have that person at an 8 or a 9 already, so this circumstance comes up that might be a 3 or 4 on a scale of 1 to 10, but it feels like a 10 to that person because their chemistry is already stuck in this place. We're going to talk about other causes of anxiety as well, but this is one possible issue. And when we're seeing things like depression and anxiety, we're going to talk about other causes of anxiety, but the most common that we see is either a lack of minerals and low blood pressure, where the body's just kind of stressing about not having enough resources to function, and that's usually where we see depression as well. The anxiety and panic attacks can also come from another imbalance we'll talk about in a minute. Bipolar disorders are really common to see when there's a blood sugar dysregulation issue like we were talking about, where someone's having hypoglycemic spikes and crashes. So when the blood sugar is available, they'll feel okay, but when they have those crashes and the minerals are also going low at the same time, now all of a sudden they're a totally different person. We'll get into some schizophrenia stuff in a bit too, but OCD, ADHD is often just seems to be like a low mineral issue in a lot of places. Signals are not being sent and received like they should because there's not enough minerals in the system for things to go correctly. And sometimes with some of these other issues, you'll see people using antidepressants to help some of these other issues, and they seem to be helpful in some circumstances because, again, they seem to restrict a person's ability to pee out their salts, more minerals accumulate, and then signals can travel a little bit better. OCD, I kind of see that a lot with, either low minerals or a fight or flight kind of state, where it just kind of seems like the body's in a bit of a panic, and if a person can kind of organize anything in the world at all, it seems to help them feel a little bit better because, I don't know, is it because there's so much disorganization in the body? I don't know, but that just seems to be what shows up a lot. But in more cases than not, the digestion is a foundation of a problem because it's either restricting nutrients from coming in and creating these electrolyte deficiency type issues, or maybe the inability to process proteins and fats correctly is causing the person to gravitate towards more carbs and sugars and creating these hypoglycemic type reactions just from turning that insulin into a bully. So is it really the digestion's fault? It's really not always, but if you think about trying to help a person correct this behavior that they're doing, it can be very impossible for them to do that when they can't digest the foods that you're trying to get them to eat. If you're telling them, oh, you need more protein, oh, you need more fats, get some more fiber in there. Well, if they're having this issue where they can't break down protein and they have all of these, bad bacteria or dysbiosis issues going on when you put fiber in there, sometimes that can really magnify symptoms from that problem. When they can't have bile flowing, they can't emulsify the fats. It's hard for them to change and do the right thing when they feel much worse when they take those steps. They think you're an idiot. Why would I do that? Why would I continue? I feel worse. Are you not seeing the part where I feel worse? Well, there's malfunctions that need to be corrected, and then all of a sudden they could feel a whole lot better. Which brings us back to this, gut flora situation with a possible dysbiosis. And we look at this study here, gut microbiota's effect on mental health, the gut-brain axis. And they say the bidirectional link between the brain, gut, and microbiome has come to the forefront of the medical research community in the past few years. The growing amount of evidence substantiating this link indicates it will be a valuable area for future medical and nutritional practice and research. This review demonstrates the importance of a healthy microbiome, particularly the gut microbiota, for patients suffering from anxiety and depression, as dysbiosis and inflammation in the CNS have been linked as potential causes of mental illness. Of note, studies have shown that probiotics effectively mitigated anxiety and depressive symptoms similar to conventional prescription medications. So that's a really big piece of information that they're saying in some of these studies. They have shown that by just using probiotics, they've created the same level improvement to these anxiety and depressive type symptoms as medications that are used for these purposes, without the side effects. So one thing to understand is that I'm not saying, oh, just use some probiotics and everything is going to be fixed. In my opinion, that's usually not going to happen, which is why a lot of these studies are showing mixed results with these probiotics. And when you see mixed results, the scientific world is going to say, oh, that's not the answer, must be something else, let's keep searching. Even if that one answer really helped a whole lot of people. If it doesn't help everybody, that's probably not it. But the problem is, remember, that when these functions are not working in the digestive process, it opens the door for bad guys to come in. Now, if you already have the hood in your gut flora and it's just not a good neighborhood at all, and you put probiotics where you're putting these good guys in there, well, they're going to go to battle with all the bad guys are in there. So that can often create a magnification of symptoms. So this person is going to use these probiotics and say, well, not only did that not help my depression or anxiety symptoms, I feel a whole lot worse. I'm having all these other digestive symptoms. This is obviously not the answer for me. What they really needed to do was they needed to fix any digestive malfunctions that are there, and keep in mind that when there's a dysbiosis, there's almost always digestive malfunctions going on because that's how all the bad guys got in the first place. So they need to fix these malfunctions so they can shut the front door and then reduce any overgrowth issues, whether they're in the stomach or the small intestine or they've moved down here into this large intestine area. Reduce those so then when you put the good guys in there and you put the beneficial probiotics in there, they can reestablish a good gut flora in this gut. Because it's been shown that these bacteria here in the gut really help us access nutrients in the food better. They process the food that's coming through there in a way that makes it easier for us to access those nutrients. A lot of people feel like it's the gut bacteria that make a lot of our B vitamins for us. And there's been a lot of indications showing that B vitamin deficiencies have the ability to create some specific mental health issues. So we can see that this is really a big picture here. We want to fix these things. And what I don't want you to do is just take one piece of information. He said probiotics helped. I'm just going to do that. He said these PPIs said that this study showed that PPIs were causing depression. I'm just going to stop taking my PPI. Well, you don't want to do that if you're having a reflux issue. These acids coming back up the esophagus have the ability to damage that lining. You don't want to just stop a PPI without fixing the actual underlying cause of that acid reflux. And we have a lot of videos that talk about how to do that. I'll put a link in the description below for our video on why do I have acid reflux if you need to dig into that. But just remember that this is a whole picture that we want to look at. And yes, it can be frustrating when studies are not looking at the whole body and looking at the actual person that's dealing with the issues. That can be very frustrating, but that's just the world that we live in. And I don't need you to take this information and change the world. That's going to be a difficult task. I just want you to be able to take this information and have the option to change your world. So let's move on to the next very common cause, and this is a metabolism disruption issue. And we learned this from George Watson, who has a book called Nutrition and Your Mind. It's an amazing book. It's a very easy read, but it's an older book and it's out of print. It can be a little bit harder to find. You can sometimes find people selling it on Amazon, but it really does help you understand some of the amazing work that he did with mental health and nutrition. And William Walcott kind of followed his work a little bit, and he has a book, The Metabolic Typing Diet or something like that. And the book is okay. I didn't really love it. I didn't like some of the things that he kind of did with it. I really like the work of George Watson a whole lot better, and that's who we follow. That's the information that we use when we're looking at our clients. But it's really about an oxidation rate that goes on with your metabolism. And when we're breaking down our food so the body can use that as fuel, there's an oxidation process that goes on. And some people will oxidize these foods very quickly, and some people will oxidize them very slowly. And this can be dictated, it appears, by the pH of the blood. Our blood has a very narrow pH that it has to stay within, or we just kind of die. But it does have the ability to lean a little bit more on the acidic side or lean a little bit more on the alkaline side. And if it's leaning too far in one of those directions, it has the ability to change how the body is operating a little bit. So the pH of the blood seems to have the ability to affect this oxidation rate. So if the pH of the blood is leaning more on that acidic side, then that has the ability to speed up that oxidation rate. So a person would be what we call like a fast oxidizer, basically. So what we want to look at is that some people will be slow at this oxidation process, and some people will be fast at this oxidation process. Then some foods are very difficult to oxidize. Foods that are higher in purine proteins, things like dark chicken meat or steak or beef. These foods that are higher in the purine proteins, maybe salmon, that's a higher purine protein. So these foods can be harder to oxidize. Then there are also foods that are easier to oxidize, like white meat chicken and white fish. These foods oxidize a little bit easier. So we have foods that are harder to oxidize and easy to oxidize. And then we have people that oxidize foods slower and oxidize them faster. So when we're looking at this, we're really looking for the ability for a meal to sustain a person. Does a person rip through that fuel too quickly, or do they have a hard time processing that fuel at all? So if you take a person that's very slow at oxidizing, and then you give them a food that's very difficult to oxidize, they're going to have a harder time turning it into fuel. So it's almost like they didn't really eat that whole meal. They're not able to utilize it the way that someone else might be able to. And then the body might not have the fuel it needs, and the brain might not have the fuel it needs. Or if you take a person that's very fast at oxidizing and you give them a food that's very easy to oxidize, they're going to rip through it like that. Their fuel is going to be gone because they used it all up and there's going to be nothing left. So with George Watson, he was doing work where he was finding people that were like having schizophrenia issues and major issues where they were hardly even a functioning human, couldn't even have a real conversation that made sense with another human. But when he adjusted either their body chemistry to help them oxidize at a different rate, or he adjusted the foods that they were consuming, all of a sudden the brain can get fuel for a sustained level of time, and they were just a person. Now, the amazing thing is that this was great research, but I've seen this firsthand with individuals in my office. I've seen schizophrenic people that were diagnosed as schizophrenic, having major issues, been in institutions, and they came and we worked on these things, and they just turned into a completely different person. Does that mean that that's going to happen with you? That's not what I'm saying, but I've seen this firsthand a lot of times. So when we're looking at schizophrenia, that's a pretty significant issue. But what we see with clients on an individual basis is that sometimes these issues can be going on at a lower level. And maybe it's creating symptoms that are not quite as significant as schizophrenia, but it's still the brain and the body having a hard time keeping sustained fuel and continuing to work for a sustained period of time. So to get an idea if this might be a problem for you, you can look at something as simple as your breath rate. You can just take your iPhone and you can just do a little timer on there for 60 seconds and then just relax and count the number of inhales that you have in a 60-second period. Don't count inhale 1, exhale 2, just count the inhales. And if the number of breaths that you take in that 60-second period is below 12, that can be a sign that your blood may be leaning a little bit more on that alkaline side, and you may be leaning on that slower side of the oxidizing pattern. Now, if your breath rate is faster than like 18 or 19, that's a sign that you're leaning on that fast side, and maybe you're ripping through some of these fuels a little bit too quickly. Now, this is not a diagnostic thing, and people will say, oh, you should alkalize, eat an alkalizing diet. And there's all these alkalizing gurus out there that are making a lot of people worse because some people are leaning already too far on that alkaline side. So don't look at things like your urine pH or saliva pH to get an idea of what your blood pH is. those do not line up. People think that they do, but that's fiction. So don't use that. We like to look at the breath rate. That's a better indication of what is likely going on. But if your breath rate is way too fast, like if it's like 22, 23 in a minute, that person is usually going to be having mental issues. If I have a client come to me and their breath rate is like 23, I always ask them, do you live with anybody? And they're like, yeah, I live with my husband, I live with my roommate. Okay, does your roommate ever say that you're crazy? I want to know if they, because a lot of times we don't know when we're acting a little bit crazy or that we just have these mental issues that show up. A lot of times we don't know. But if we live with somebody, they know, and they often tell us about it. So I like them to have that marker because I want to see when you take these steps, does that improve? Do the people around you notice, wow, they just seem a lot more stable? So if you check this and your breath rate is really fast, there's steps you can take to bring that down, to alkalize that bloodstream and balance it out so the body can work the way that it's supposed to. Choline is a great supplement that can help alkalize that bloodstream a little bit. And choline can also help thin out the bile so it flows better, like we were talking with the digestion. So if that's appropriate for somebody's body chemistry, it sure could be helpful. Now, is choline good for mental health? No, it's not, because if somebody's on the slow side and their blood is already leaning too alkaline, choline is going to make them much worse. It's not about the supplement that's magic, it's about looking at the person. So if a person had their breath rate way too fast, they could take supplements to try to balance that out and bring down their breath rate, but they could also change the foods that they're eating. They could move to some of these harder to oxidize foods that would act like a slow burning log on the fire. So they might rip through a chicken breast way too fast, but if they ate salmon or a steak, maybe that takes longer to oxidize for them and gives them a longer fuel source that sustains them through the day. Now what I find is that this adjustment in protein levels, and George Watson and William Walcott talk a lot about other foods that will oxidize at different rates, but we find that it's really the proteins that make the biggest difference. And you're not going to go through all this trouble to eat all these different foods that line up perfect. If you just adjust your proteins according to the way that you're oxidizing, it can really be beneficial. But if somebody's going to do these harder to oxidize foods like a steak or something, those are also harder to break down than like white chicken breast. So somebody really needs to fix digestive malfunctions before they can do this and see really great results. But when we look at this study here on the frenetic component of acute schizophrenia, a name and its physiological reality, they say we have shown that the regulation of respiration is severely disturbed in patients with schizophrenia. First, patients breathe faster and shallower than controls as shown previously. So what's happening when we're looking at this breath rate is when the blood is leaning too far on that acidic side, well, the body has this backup mechanism to try to balance it out. CO2 is what we expel when we breathe out. CO2 comes out. CO2 is also acidic. So if that blood is leaning too far on the acidic side, the body will speed up the rate at which we're breathing in an effort to expel more CO2 and balance out the pH of the blood. If the blood is leaning too far on the alkaline side, this can create major oxygen utilization issues through the Bohr effect, and that can be a really big problem for some people. So the body doesn't want that to happen, so it will slow the rate at which it's breathing in an effort to hold on to more CO2 and help acidify that blood and balance out the pH that way. So understand that purposefully changing the rate at which you're breathing, like a lot of people say can really help a lot of things, is not going to fix this. This is not something that you want to fix manually by changing the way that you're breathing. The body is trying to fix a problem by adjusting the breathing. That would be like going up to an angry dog and grabbing his tail and wagging it and say, oh, if I wag your tail, you'll be happy, because dogs always wag their tail when they're happy. You can't force this to happen. You have to fix it from the inside. So let's move on to the last common underlying cause we're going to talk about, and this is a problem at the cellular level with imbalances. It's kind of dealing with your circadian rhythm, but don't view it like, oh, I sleep great, my circadian rhythm must be just jazzy. The circadian rhythm is about a lot more than just sleep, and we understood this from Dr. Emmanuel Rivisi, who helped us understand that there's this natural circadian rhythm in the body at the cellular level. So during the day, we should be in this catabolic state where the body is very good at creating energy, and it's also very good at breaking down tissues so that they can be rebuilt and renewed. And then at night, the body should move into this anabolic state where it's very good at sleeping and resting, but it's also very good at rebuilding and repairing. So both of these states are appropriate. We want both of them. The problem is some people, for a wide variety of reasons, can get stuck in one of these states most of the time. And if a person is stuck in one of these states, it has the ability to create a wide variety of symptoms. One of the more important things for this conversation is that if someone's stuck in this anabolic nighttime rest and repair state most of the time, it has the ability to change the way the body creates energy. In this anabolic state, the body likes to create energy through fermentation. Now, when the body creates energy through fermentation, a byproduct of that process is lactic acid. Well, I'll put some links to some studies below that show us that when lactic acid goes very high, it has the ability to create anxiety and even panic attacks. So a lot of times when people are dealing with anxiety, it can be from low resources, it can be from being stuck in that sympathetic fight or flight state, but one of the more common causes that we see is someone stuck in this anabolic state, so they're creating all this lactic acid all the time, faster than the body can get rid of it. And as it accumulates, it can raise the level of anxiety in a person, even all the way up to panic attacks. And if you can help the body move into this catabolic state during the day and correct this imbalance so it goes back and forth from day to night like it's supposed to, that can reduce that level of lactic acid in the body and really reduce the anxiety they're experiencing. So when you're looking at improving your own mental health issues, the answer should be obvious. I don't know. We just talked about a whole lot of stuff. There's a wide variety of underlying causes that can show up, and they're not going to be the same for every person. And that's why it's not obvious from person to person. But when we look at these things that we went over, and the biggest part for you right now is to try to just not feel overwhelmed by all of this, because that was a whole lot of information, and you have no idea which one is creating the problems for you. You might be able to say, oh, I do have a lot of digestive symptoms, so that makes sense. Maybe I do seem like I'm in a fight or flight state a lot. Maybe that sympathetic issue is a problem, but you really want to just look at your body chemistry and get an idea of what's going on. And it's about understanding how to do that. I'm going to give you some free resources in the description below this video that help you understand how to do that and walk you through that process. My book, Kick Your Fat in the Nuts, will kind of walk you through that. And we also have a free digestion course if you prefer video action, and that'll walk you through all that process as well. But it's about just running simple self-tests at home that you can do with tools that you pick up at like a pharmacy or a health food store. And these are all simple things to do, and either that free book or the free course are going to walk you through understanding, what are my self-tests telling me? What kind of imbalances or malfunctions might my body be dealing with, so that I understand where I should be putting my attention. When you understand that this is going to take effort, you really want to put your attention towards something that makes sense for you and your body chemistry. You don't just want to throw darts at the remedy dartboard. It's going to take you a really long time. It took me 8 years to get my voice back because I was working against my body instead of with it. You really want to work with your body. So when we're looking at these possible things that can show up, when we're looking at things like an electrolyte deficiency that may be going on, we need to understand, well, these things up here tell me to eat less processed carbs and sugars, and I should eat more proteins and fats. But if you don't have the digestive capacity to do that, you're not ready to take that step. If your blood pressure is really low, you might need a little bit more carbs. You might need even a small amount of sugar each day to help you keep in a functional state where you can be a human being. Remember, if your insulin goes way too low when your minerals are way too low, that can make you pee out even more minerals. So when a client has really low blood pressure, we like to see them use a little bit more carbs, but maybe carbs that don't create such a spike and crash. They're not having pasta and potatoes. Maybe it's more like butternut squash or Brussels sprouts or yams, something that has an amount of carbs in it that can give them what they need without creating such a big spike and crash. Either of those free resources will also help you walk through figuring out which aspects of digestion may not be working correctly and what steps you can take to help improve those. Remember, that is the major foundation. We need this digestive process working correctly so that we can bring the nutrients in that the body needs so that it can function correctly. But the biggest thing to remember is that you don't want to stop anything that's helping you right now. If you're using therapy and it's helping, you want to continue to do that. The point is that I've seen clients that were going to a therapist for an hour and a half every day, Monday through Friday, for 10 years. But when they fixed these things, they just felt like they didn't need that therapy. They were feeling good enough on their own that they didn't need that anymore. 10 years every single day, you could buy a small yacht with that kind of money that you're spending. So if you have the ability to just help the body function correctly, it may reduce some of these other burdens that you're dealing with. That doesn't mean that therapy can't help somebody. It absolutely can help a lot of people. So can these medications. And if all of this sounds like way too much effort for you, I don't want to put all that effort in, I just want to take a pill. Well, then the medications might be your only option. It doesn't matter if you don't feel good or they have side effects that you don't like. If you're not willing to put the effort in to fix the actual underlying causes, there are these medications that can make it a lot easier for you to do, to improve your situation, even if it's not the ideal situation you want. It's really about the amount of effort you're willing to put in to make your life a better situation. But this can be a big nut to crack and a big puzzle to solve. I like to see people, if they're having digestive symptoms, start with that. Just tackle one thing at a time and figure out what maybe other imbalances are very obvious to you. Some places you're going to be balanced in. Some places things are going to be working great, so you can just focus your attention on the things that seem to be going wrong. Maybe a person has lost their gallbladder. Either the book or the free course can walk you through steps that can help in those scenarios. So there's always steps you can take, even if things seem to have gone a little bit awry. And just keep in mind that your puzzle might have some tricky things to it. There's other causes of mental health issues. There's heavy metal issues. There's things and toxins that can come in from things like smoking and situations like that, mold exposure. There's a variety of other things that can happen. But we went over today the main things that are the most common that can create the widest variety of improvement for the widest variety of people. So start where you can start. Don't beat yourself up too much if it all doesn't go perfectly right away. There's going to be some ups and downs into you figuring out your body and what's going to help that the most. But if you want to get started, just go into the description below this video and you can find the link to download that book for free, or you can find the link for that free digestion course and you can get started. Or if you really know that you have a lot of digestive issues right now, you can jump over and check out our video on full digestive reset to get started on that process. I can't wait to hear about your results.